Good morning. Again, all of you brave souls. I am so glad that you are here this morning because I have been looking forward to this Sunday for many, many weeks. I've been looking forward to all the Sundays in Lent, actually, because each Sunday this year in Lent, we get to hear a different parable from Jesus. Parables that he tells to the disciples in order to prepare them for the passion that's coming, for the week when he will be crucified and die, and then be miraculously resurrected. Some of the parables that we'll hear go a little bit like this. The kingdom of heaven is like a king settling accounts. The kingdom of heaven is like a businessman hiring new employees. The kingdom of heaven is like a father who throws a great wedding party. The kingdom of heaven is like 10 bridesmaids all dressed up in their bridesmaids' gowns waiting for the groom to come to the wedding. The kingdom of heaven is like herding sheep and goats. At first glance, I love parables. They're some of my favorite parts of the Bible. They're like these riddles that Jesus tells that just keep on unwinding. I'm drawn in by the fact that they never, ever say what we think they say. I'm intrigued that Jesus seems to tell his disciples stories that never make sense if you really pay attention to what Jesus is saying. And most of all, I think I love that these parables, these riddles of Jesus, remind me of a 1990s television show that I watched religiously every week called Tool Time. You may remember it because Tim Allen, the father, is now back on TV again, and he is Last Man Standing, is I think the TV show he's now in. But the father in the family, played by Tim Allen, called Tim Taylor, I think was his name on the TV show, would often get frustrated by his family or by his coworkers or by just about everyone in the world that he knew. And usually then he would go out in the yard and run into his wise neighbor Wilson, who he would see and meet across the fence. Wilson would never tell him what to do to solve his problems. Instead, Wilson would tell him a riddling story that would help Tim make sense of his life. Like Jesus' riddles, Wilson's riddles usually began with the words, "Well, you see, Tim," just like Jesus begins every single of his riddles, the kingdom of heaven is like. And when Wilson would finish his story, Tim was never quite sure what Wilson had told him. And he always got the stories turned around and mixed up when he tried to tell them to someone else. But those same riddling stories of Wilson's that didn't make sense the second time around, well, they also changed Tim's life in the process, or at least changed his actions that he decided to take the next day. I was excited then for this Lent, excited to try to untangle all of Jesus' holy riddles and jokes that he seems to tell to the disciples. I was excited, that is, until I actually tried to untangle our parable for today. First, Jesus walks his disciples through this whole long process of seeking reconciliation between conflicted brothers and sisters in the church. You know what this is like. He sets up a process that sounds pretty truthful and honest and might work, but it could also backfire on me just as easily if both sides don't want to seek reconciliation. And then Peter, the good disciple who's always trying to figure out how to be an even better disciple and get a star for the day, asked Jesus how many times he should forgive another person of faith, his brother or his sister. How about 7 times, he says, because 7 actually, if you think about it, is a lot of times. You were supposed to meet someone for dinner and they stood you up 6 times, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't show up a seventh time and wait for them to stand you up. But Jesus, 7 times is not enough for Jesus. And he blows Peter's sin counting out of the water when he says, nope, 7 times is not enough. But I tell you, 77 times. Or some people think he might have said 70 times 7 times. And for all of you out there who don't really like to do math on a Sunday morning, that means all of the time. How many times do you forgive? All of the time. But Jesus still isn't finished, because then he gets to the parable that got me all mixed up today. The king decides to settle his accounts with his servants. So he goes to the first one and forgives him much more than $77, but forgives him 10,000 talents worth of debt when the servant pleads to the king that he'll pay him back eventually. We may not know what a talent means, but it's a ludicrous scenario that Jesus sets up. For 10,000 talents was equal to $1.5 billion today. It was 150,000 years of wages of work. It's ridiculous. But the king would have even allowed the servant to get into this sort of debt in the first place. It's even more ridiculous that just because the servant pleads that he'll be able to pay it off, if the king just gives him a little bit more time, that he would be able to do so. It's even more ridiculous that the king will just up and forgives a debt of more than 150,000 years worth of work. This is a king who is ridiculously forgiving. That is, until we get to the end of the parable. Until we get to the time when the servant can't do the same. When the now forgiven servant goes out and tries to collect a debt owed to him by another servant, and then, bam! It's like the forgiven servant has crossed some invisible line that he didn't know was sitting there for him, because now the king chooses not to forgive him anymore. He won't. He will forgive 150,000 years worth of debt, but he won't forgive the servant's lack of forgiveness. And so the servant gets punished forever. Truthfully, I don't like this king very much. I'm left more in fear of this king than anyone else. He seems so forgiving, so gracious, so merciful at first, and then he wasn't. Doesn't make sense. And in parables where we like to turn the one in power into God, I don't know what to do with a parable where the king is forgiving and then suddenly he changes his mind. And I'm not sure I'm excited for all these parables coming at us in Lent anymore. This would be a gospel that's easier to swallow, easier to understand and pack up and put in our pockets and go on our way, if the gospel just ended at verse 22, with Jesus' seemingly nice answer to Peter when he just says, forgive 77 times, forgive all the time. But Jesus kept talking and told that tricky, wacko parable. But perhaps that's why Jesus doesn't stop by saying forgive 77 times, because honestly, forgiveness is never that simple. It's never that easy either. Forgiveness doesn't work like it does when we're taught as children or in that nice children's book that I just read to the girls. Rarely is one person so easily in the wrong and the other person so easily the one who is just waiting to hear the words, I'm sorry, that will make it all better. Sometimes life is that simple. But more often we are more complicated. We are in relationships that are messier and more tangled up. We are fragile with skin that bruises easily and doesn't let us just say, okay, that's okay, I accept your forgiveness. And when you put all of us broken, sinful, often selfish people together and we become the church united, we will cause each other pain and tangled webs of misunderstanding. We will hide and shame and blame and talk behind each other's backs to make ourselves look better and to soothe our own egos. And we often won't even know that we're doing it, or we'll shove it under the rug and pretend like everything is okay because we're nice people in the church. The only sense that I can make from Jesus' shocking parable in response to Peter's question of how many times he has to forgive the sins of another is that forgiveness is a never-ending part of being alive. We will never stop needing to be forgiven the enormous, often ludicrous amount of sins that we rack up on a daily basis. And we will never stop needing to forgive the sins of those done against us. Otherwise, we'll do like the last servant does to himself. We'll lock ourselves up in a prison of guilt and anger and trap ourselves in what feels like hell on earth of our own making, like the servant who couldn't forgive. Lord, if a brother or sister in the church sins against me, how many times should I forgive, says Peter? 7 times? Not 7 times, says Jesus, but 77 times. For the kingdom of heaven is like a king who has already forgiven you even more than 77 times. Do unto others as the king has already done unto you. Do unto others as Jesus is already preparing to do for all of the sinners and the debtors of this world, when he will take his cross and carry it into the middle of a garbage dump piled up in Jerusalem, and take unto himself all of the pain, the unreconciled relationships, the violence that we cause to one another and to this world, and will seek to make new life out of our devastation, and will transform our sin against God and against one another into unending forgiveness. And he will open up a door that has been closed on our past when we cannot forgive, and open up a new future when he utters the words that clench fear into our hearts when he says, Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. We may not ever be able to forgive all of the wrongs. We may not be able to forgive all of the hurt or all of the sin committed against us in this lifetime. Some actions are too atrocious for us to even contemplate being able to forgive. We may not be able to either to receive forgiveness for all of the hurt that we cause to one another. But like the king, who goes out seeking to settle accounts and make all things right, God has promised in his very flesh and blood to keep on seeking to forgive you and all of your brothers and sisters, invoking mercy when we cannot, spreading grace between brothers when we cannot, until at the end of time, until that moment comes in a new day when God's forgiveness takes root in you and changes your life forever, and transforms you from a debtor into a child of God. And you walk out from that unforgiven place that feels like hell on earth, and you are transformed to live in the kingdom of heaven here on earth. For the kingdom of heaven is like a king who has already forgiven you your sins. Amen.